Computer. And I'm going to spotlight myself.
Hey, Ken, can I say something
Yes,
before you mute me?
sure.
I just spent a long weekend with my daughter's family, and my grandson, he's starting college next year at UC Santa Cruz in computer science, and he's like into programming and that. But he says there's actually another major in computers. It sounds like that, and it's based on and I'm so computer illiterate that I can't even explain this. I barely understand it. But it sounded sort of like that, where how to make people buy more stuff or do more stuff on the computer, how to get people's attention
Right.
through the computer for commercial stuff. And it's a whole major. I
Yeah,
can't,
yeah,
it's incredible.
yeah. Anyway, that thing I was just showing there was a guy who was completely a Wall Street type of guy, and he's drawing on Debord to articulate, the difference between what does he say, flash and something else or something.
Talk about spectacular.
Yeah. Okay, anyway, so I'm going to put my spotlight myself, and I'm going to mute everybody, and Kim, you can unmute yourself. Okay. Us, as well as a lot of the Jews and gypsies and a lot of other things there. So after that fiasco, Stalin suddenly does another turnaround, and he says, oh, we've got to fight fascism now. That's the danger. And so we're going to ally not only with the socialists, but with practically anybody except the fascists. We'll ally with the socialists, with the, well, not the Trotskyists because they're out of bounds, but we'll even ally with conservative ones as long as they're not fascist. And that was called the United Front Against Fascism. And the means of that was supposed to be popular fronts. We're uniting all these diverse groupings against this huge threat of fascism. And so he does that after fascism has already won in Italy and Germany. And so then in France, the Popular Front, they do form that, all these various lefty or more or less liberal groups get together, and the Popular Front wins in 1936 in France. So there's a Popular Front government there. And then the same thing is going on in Spain under more difficult circumstances. There too, there was a Popular Front government or group of parties, and they ran for election and they won in 1936. And so there was now a Spanish Republic. It wasn't a monarchy anymore, and all this. And in both cases, that Popular Front that included Stalinists in it as one of their key parts, end up making all these compromises. So we already talked about the Spanish Revolution in the previous meeting or two. The Spanish Popular Front was, of course, against fascism. And then when Franco, the fascist, revolts against them, okay, we got to do this. But they kind of didn't do very much. And so in Spain, that triggered the Spanish Revolution, particularly in Barcelona and Catalonia, where the workers were saying, well, our Popular Front government isn't doing anything. We've got to get the arms and fight this. So they fought off Franco for a while, and that's a whole other story. And in France, they didn't have anything like Franco to deal with, but it was a kind of compromised regime that was supposedly progressive and pro-worker and so on, but it ended up breaking strikes and as these things did. So that's a little, we can get into that later if you want to. This is what Debord is talking about, that the Russian regime, which we can start calling Stalinist after about 1930 or so, Stalin is in total control, is making all these compromises. Whereas originally the Third International was founded supposedly to stir up revolution around the world. That was its nominal thing. And it said, do like we did in Russia. Yeah, seize power, all this. So the Russian bureaucracy then carried this consolidation of power to the next stage in Russia by subjecting the peasantry to a reign of terror, implementing the most brutal primitive accumulation of capital in history. The industrialization of the Stalin era revealed the bureaucracy's ultimate function, continuing the reign of the economy by preserving the essence of market society, namely commodified labor. It also demonstrated the independence of the economy. The economy has come to dominate society so completely that it has proved capable of recreating the class domination it needs for its own continued operation. That is, the bourgeoisie has created an independent power, the commodity, that is capable of maintaining itself even without a bourgeoisie, i.e., via the bureaucracy. The totalitarian bureaucracy was not the, quote, last owning society in history in Bruno Rizzi's sense. It was merely a substitute ruling class for the commodity economy. Bruno Rizzi was a guy who wrote a book in the late 30s. He was maybe the first person to say, hey, this bureaucracy is a new class. So that's why Debord is kind of giving him a little nod there. A faltering capitalist property system was replaced by a cruder version of itself, simplified, less diversified, and concentrated as the collective property of the bureaucratic class. All this is what's happening in Russia. This underdeveloped type of ruling class is also a reflection of economic underdevelopment, and it has no agenda beyond overcoming this underdevelopment in certain regions of the world. The hierarchical and status framework for this crude remake of the capitalist ruling class was provided by the Working Class Party, which was itself modeled on the hierarchical separations of bourgeois organizations. As Antti Siliga noted while in one of Stalin's prisons, quote, technical questions of organization turned out to be social questions, unquote. That was from Siliga was a Communist Party guy from Yugoslavia who ended up being in one of Stalin's concentration camps or prisons in the 30s. And he was one of the few people that managed to get out, like before everybody just got killed in around 1936 and 37. And when he got out, he wrote a book called The Russian Enigma. And Lenin and the Revolution, this thing quoted here, is just a chapter from that book. So 105, the next one. Leninism was the highest voluntaristic expression of revolutionary ideology, a coherence of the separate governing a reality that resisted it. With the advent of Stalinism, revolutionary ideology returned to its fundamental incoherence. At that point, ideology was no longer a weapon, it had become an end in itself. But a lie that can no longer be challenged becomes insane. The totalitarian ideological pronouncement obliterates reality as well as purpose. Nothing exists but what it says exists. So we're getting this description of Stalinism, which is kind of similar to the 1984 society. Although this crude form of the spectacle has been confined to certain underdeveloped regions, it has nevertheless played an essential role in the spectacle's global development. This particular materialization of ideology did not transform the world economically, as did advanced capitalism. It simply used police state methods to transform people's perception of the world. 106. The ruling totalitarian ideological class is the ruler of a world turned upside down. The more powerful the class, the more it claims not to exist, and its power is employed above all to enforce this claim. It is modest only on this one point, however, because this officially non-existent bureaucracy simultaneously attributes the crowning achievements of history to its own infallible leadership. Though its existence is everywhere in evidence, the bureaucracy must be invisible as a class. As a result, all social life becomes insane. The social organization of total falsehood stems from this fundamental contradiction. I'll read one more and then we'll stop to discuss. Stalinism was also a reign of terror within the bureaucratic class. The terrorism on which this class's power was based inevitably came to strike the class itself, because this class has no juridical legitimacy. Juridical means like sort of legal or something like judicial. No legally recognized status as an owning class which could be extended to each of its members. I'll just pause here. It's like this is an interesting point. Like if you're a member of the upper Communist Party, not just the run-of-the-mill militant, but say you're in the top 100 people or something, you are part of an entity that owns everything, like in Russia or in later times in China and other such places. But you don't own that because you've got a deed in your pocket that says, I own 1/100th of Russia. I am empowered to do this. You don't own shit. You only have power insofar as you are a member of the upper echelon of the Communist Party. And you may have a Communist Party membership card or something like that, but that doesn't mean anything. Stalin could just say, go shoot that guy and you're dead. Or anything in between. He can humiliate you, he can kick you out of the party, he can exile you to Siberia, anything he wants to do. And you can't appeal to a Supreme Court, say, wait a minute, I have the right to do this, like you could if you were a capitalist in the United States. If somebody was taking your property, you say, wait a minute, I own this property. This proves it. And the police are defend that. In this case, the police aren't going to do anything for you because you have no legal right. You're just part of this entity. And it's kind of a weird thing if you think about it, like this entity in which you are absolutely helpless. But by being part of it, you're part of this totalitarian thing. It's like you're one of the fingers of the emperor or something. And so you can take pride in this, and up to a certain point, you can do all kinds of things, and you may acquire as a secondary side effect wealth, power, something. But at any moment, Stalin can say, forget that guy. It turns out he's a traitor. lock him up, kill him. And there's nothing you can do. So no legalized recognized status as an owning class which could be extended to each of its members. Its ownership has to be masked because it is based on false consciousness. Remember, the consciousness, the theory of this is that the Bolshevik Party represents the workers in some kind of mystical way. It's not like they're not forced to have to, do anything. It's just kind of by an early definition, Lenin or somebody said, we're for the workers and we represent the authentic workers' interests here. There may be workers who don't understand that, but that. And so somehow you're having to say the party represents the workers, but the workers themselves actually have zero to say about that, even though ostensibly they elevated the party to power. So that's the false consciousness. The communist bureaucrat can't say, I'm a representative of the workers, because wait a minute, the workers didn't vote for you. And he also can't say, I'm a bureaucrat, because no, there's no bureaucracy. We've abolished classes. So that's what Debord is talking about. This false consciousness can maintain its total power only by means of a total reign of terror in which all real motives are ultimately obscured. The members of the ruling bureaucratic class have the right of ownership over society only collectively as participants in a fundamental lie. They have to play the role of the proletariat governing a socialist society. They have to be actors faithful to a script of ideological betrayal. Yet they cannot actually participate in this counterfeit entity unless their legitimacy is validated. No bureaucrat can individually assert his right to power, because to prove himself a socialist proletarian, he would have to demonstrate that he was the opposite of a bureaucrat. While to prove himself a bureaucrat is impossible, because the bureaucracy's official line is that there is no bureaucracy. Each bureaucrat is thus totally dependent on the central seal of legitimacy provided by the ruling ideology, which validates the collective participation in its socialist regime of all the bureaucrats it does not liquidate. Although the bureaucrats are collectively empowered to make all social decisions, the cohesion of their own class can be ensured only by the concentration of their terrorist power in a single person. In this person resides the only practical truth of the ruling lie, the power to determine an unchallengeable boundary line, which is nevertheless constantly being adjusted. Stalin decides without appeal who is and who is not a member of the ruling bureaucracy, who should be considered a, quote, proletarian power, unquote, and who branded as, quote, a traitor in the pay of Wall Street and the Mikado, the Japanese emperor, unquote. The atomized bureaucrats can find their collective legitimacy only in the person of Stalin, the Lord of the world, who thus comes to see himself as the absolute person for whom no superior spirit exists. Quote, this is a quote from Hegel. In this case, the Lord and Master of the world recognizes his own nature, omnipresent power, through the destructive violence he exerts against the contrastingly powerless selfhood of his subjects, unquote. He is the power that defines the terrain of domination, and he is also the power that ravages that terrain. Those Hegel quotes, Hegel is talking about the Roman emperors in his philosophy of history, and this kind of weird thing, like what is it like to be Nero? oh, well, you've got the whole world, and you can, it's kind of a weird thing because you're the only real person in the world. Everybody else is just, you know, your tool, or you can just destroy them, and there's nothing that they can do about it. So Debord is updating this thing to say that's exactly what Stalin is, maybe even more than the Roman emperors were, who didn't have the kind of power Stalin had in the way of secret police and stuff like that. So let's stop there and see what comments or questions anybody has. You can always write things in the chat, and Kim will keep track of that. And you can also raise your digital hand. So Peter, please unmute
Yeah,
yourself.
sorry if I'm traveling, so I might be a little bit far
Oh,
away
okay.
in
I see
terms
you're
of the
not
voice.
even
I
on
don't
the
know,
video,
but
but go ahead with we can hear you.
yeah. But I think these are a couple interesting theses. And I think Debord is right. When he quotes what is it, Saliga about the organizational form. It's really interesting because I think the syndicalists who are writing around this time had said, hey, look, the party isn't really representative of the workers' consciousness. They're, people don't learn how to be party members by working in a factory or a business, but the workers' councils do flow out of their consciousness. The problem is, I think, with the revolution, the Bolsheviks were able to very quickly defeat the workers' councils, and I think they reinstituted one-person rule in the factories very quickly. So they always coexisted really uneasily with the councils, and the workers weren't able to kind of organize against the Bolsheviks. I think they might have been deluded to thinking the Bolsheviks were on their side.
Yeah.
But once Stalin gets into power in the late 20s, I mean, the terror is really him destroying any remnants of opposition in the Bolshevik party that might have arisen against him, and kind of, I think it seemed once he got in power, it's inevitable, even though there was, Bukharin, who might have been a little bit less bloodthirsty if he had come to power, but still would have been dictatorial. So it was
Yeah.
very interesting stuff.
Yeah. Judy. Unmute yourself. Yeah.
What does he mean by this when he says technical questions of organization turned out to be social questions?
Yeah.
What is
Well, remember all this discussion leading up here about how the Bolshevik Party was organized, including the things I read right at the beginning of this meeting, how Lenin keeps saying, no, in order to do this, we've got to centralize this, we have to, all this. So all those questions were debated, and people were saying, I mean, Rosa Luxemburg, who was close to Lenin in some ways, is saying, well, she was emphasizing the more democratic aspect of, okay, we want a communist party, but we want it to be, controlled by the people in the party. And Lenin is saying, well, you're being naive, that's just going to lead to chaos here. We need to do this. And so Lenin, they had those debates about what kind of organization is appropriate to, if they're going to take over the government or if they're going to take over factories and so on. And what Saliga is saying, that those debates seem to be about, well, what kind of organization are we going to have? So maybe that would seem like, well, that's not so important. That's just internal quibbling about this or that. But Saliga is saying that debate ended up meaning how the whole society is organized. If you have a political party that's led by one person or just a few people at the top, and they take power, they may say we're representing the workers and all that, But what they're going to end up doing is organizing society in a sort of parallel way. And so you end up having the entire society being controlled by a little core of people, or maybe even just one person in the capital. And everybody else, it may be called a workers' state or a popular state or the People's Democratic Republic or blah, 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 but it has nothing to do with that. It all goes back to how was the party organized? And a party that's organized in this increasingly authoritarian way ends up, this was not a speculation, here Saliga was in this party. He was, he knew Stalin, all these guys, and then he ends up being in jail or in a concentration camp or something by this. And from that new viewpoint, he said, all these debates where we said, oh, do you agree with Stalin or, they actually ended up being social questions. We weren't debating just how is the Communist Party going to organize itself, because that ended up meaning how is the society going to be organized. So, quick answer to that. Zach.
Can I just respond directly to that? I can do it later also, but
Oh, Dan, okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, it's just that I read it sort of in the opposite way. I mean, the quote is kind of somewhat vague, but I mean, the way I thought of it, and I see previous to that, like some backing for it, was that so it's not just that the way that the party or the leadership is governed has effects socially, but also the way in which you plan like a ruling elite or an organization is not something that you can just calculate. It's not a technical question inherently. It's a question of power, right? So the dynamics that you see in society can be replicated like in microcosm,
Sure.
right? So yeah, I think it goes both ways.
Well, it goes both ways, but
Yeah.
the Saliga, though, is saying we had this thing called the organization question, which we've been debating for decades. And people wanted, oh, shall it be more democratic? Shall we have more workers in the party? All these things. That was the debate. Nobody was thinking about the big social picture at that point. They were thinking, okay, we're going to take over the government, but how do we do that? And Lenin is coming in and saying, well, the best way to seize the government is by concentrating, da, da, da. So that was the thing there that seemed to be just like a technical question, like what tool do we use to fix the car? Do we use a jack or a screwdriver
Right.
or something? It seems to be, oh, well, you could use different tools and get the same thing done. But Saliga is saying it turned out that figuring out what kind of tool to use ended up having implications on what the whole society worked out for. So I think it's going that direction. You're right. It can go the other direction too. You can say a society based on classes is going to tend to create parties based on hierarchies. Even if it's nobody's consciously doing that, that's just when people form a party or an organization to do something, the first thing they'll say, well, who's going to be the chairman or the president or some, they're not even thinking about possible alternative ways because this is the way most things are run in this society. So,
Right.
yeah, it goes both ways. But in this
So
case,
they chose,
yes.
so they chose screwdrivers, and that's why it all got screwed up.
Okay, Zach.
Yeah, I had actually an unrelated question, and this may not be the best place in the book to bring it up, but since Debord started talking about state capitalism, there's one thing that I've always been confused about by the term. In number 104, Debord says, the essence of market society, commodified labor, which is certainly an important part of it, but another obviously important part is markets. And I've never been quite clear how Debord saw markets functioning in a state capitalist society in Soviet Russia. Is there some equivalent that he's identified there?
Well, in any of these societies, even the most super Stalinist or authoritarian
I mean, it's a centralized command economy. It's not a
yeah,
market.
but it's never totally a command. I mean, there's always money is still going around. People are still being paid for their labor. You may be prohibited from leaving town without your ID or something, but there is some fluctuation. It's not like a total slave labor thing. It's like you do this, you're paid for this. If you don't do that, you're in tough, you know. And if you do some of these other things, I mean, it is possible to make more money, but you do that by getting bribes or by having a black market or different things like that. The point is that labor is still for sale. In no way do workers in Russia say, oh, we're free because we're working for ourselves, because we're working for the state and it's a workers' state, so we're working for ourselves. Yay. In fact, it's obvious just by looking at it that a worker in Russia is in an even worse situation than a worker in the United States or other countries. Because there are fewer alternatives. He can't just quit his job and go off somewhere, without severe risks. And so money is still there and people are still working for that money in order to survive. So the commodified labor is still there. It's not well, does that answer?
It does. I see where you're going with that.
Yeah.
And,
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Otherwise, Kim, anything in the chat of note?
Yeah, something I just put in there relevant to what Zach was talking about the Koch brothers. Everybody knows the Koch brothers in the United States.
Yeah.
The father of these famous right-wing billionaires was Fred Koch, who started his fortune with $500,000 received from Stalin for his assistance constructing 15 oil refineries in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. A couple of years later, his company Winkler Koch helped the Nazis complete their third largest oil refinery. So there's a little bit of market history.
Yeah, I mean, bear in mind, like when one of the things that Stalin and these other bureaucrats always need to do, remember, it's all as has already been said or will be said here, is that Stalinism is like ends up just being like a poor relative of ordinary capitalism. It's just it's a capitalism in more crude form. And so it likes to pretend that it's getting beyond capitalism because, they have free childcare or something like, whatever is supposed to mean that it's socialist. But they're actually really, anyway, Sid.
This is perhaps a bit naive, but my question, the question is, we've spoken a lot about and used the words taking power, and we went over the massacre of the sailors of Kronstadt. So my question is, like, how did they actually do that? I mean, some people, they would need to control other people who were armies or soldiers, or somehow talk them into killing these other people.
Right.
So my question is, how did how did they, maybe I'm not sure about the history of it, but in what were they giving these other people to make them do what they
Okay, well, okay, I'll just sort of try to sort of oversimplify things. You have the 1917 revolution that overthrows the Tsar. So the
Okay.
Tsar is out of the picture almost instantly in February 1917. And then you've got various things going on, like what you have uh, Kerensky and these things, and Lenin comes back from exile, and you've got the Bolsheviks, and there's anarchists and social revolutionaries and Mensheviks and this whole thing. And among other things, you have Soviets, you have workers' councils, peasants' councils, sailors' councils, soldiers' councils that have just sort of sprung up spontaneously, like they did in 1905. They already had that to look back. Okay, we got Soviets, yay! We're running this. But that's kind of a vague thing. You like, well, yeah, but what do we do, or how do we do it? We're taking over this factory, but what do we do with this? So
the Soviets.
Lenin comes in and says, our program is all power to the Soviets. So that sounds really great. I mean, it sounds almost anarchistic or something. A lot of anarchists thought, oh, Lenin is coming over to our side here. So he gets, therefore, enthusiastic support from thousands of workers and peasants and soldiers who are wondering, what do we do? And hey, here's this guy who is putting forward very vigorous, let's go, come on. So they overthrow the Kerensky thing, and now the Bolsheviks are in power, but not officially. What's officially in power is sort of, well, they said it was the Soviets and all that. So there's kind of a mixed bag there. It's like, well, we're all in it together here, but those Bolsheviks seem to be the most articulate people to say, let's go, like Lenin especially. So Trotsky, at the same time, the next Bolshevik with Lenin, organizes the Red Army, so-called. And thousands of people rush in to be part of that. Who wouldn't? Because they're suddenly czarist and reactionary armies supported by the Western powers are coming in to overthrow the people's government and all that. And so you've got all these people. It's like the French Revolution. You've got all these people that says, fuck them, we've got to fight back these reactionary forces. So they get in there, and Trotsky organizes the Red Army pretty much like an army. There's no democracy in it, and that was part of his thing. He said, we need to have this like an army. And so he manages to, with that Red Army, to defeat some of these various forces coming in from all sides. He also manages to defeat or betray Makhno, which was this anarchist army in the Ukraine. That's a whole other story. Anyway, the point is that the more radical currents or popular currents were all, they said, Lenin sounds great. Tell him, and so, we've been fighting off these czarist, monarchist forces and sort of proto-fascist armies and stuff like this. So of course they're going to be popular. So 3 or 4 years later, times are hard. They've been through all this civil war, but they know what side they're on. It's the Bolshevik government and allied with supposedly with social revolutionaries and Menshevik, it's supposed to all be one big happy family here fighting against these reactionary forces.
Okay.
Now, by 1921, the government has pretty much won. All these forces have been beaten back. And now, but meanwhile, there have been other tendencies. Meanwhile, a Bolshevik secret police has been established to replace the Tsarist secret police, including some of the same policemen, by the way. And you have, various other things that the government is doing. that some of the people are being, huh? I thought this was supposed to be a workers', you know, but it's a little bit unclear. Like, well, what would you do? What's the alternative? So
Mhm.
the Kronstadt sailors, for whatever reason, partly because they were a little off to the side where they could, you know, they were literally on an island in the bay near St. Petersburg. They were in it, you know, they were among the most enthusiastic people in the original revolution.
Hmm.
And finally they've had enough. They'd say the Bolsheviks are starting to act like tyrants. We don't want that. We want power, real power to the Soviets, not pretend Soviet government or whatever you want to call it.
Mhm.
And so when that happens, Trotsky and Lenin and the top Bolsheviks all get together unanimously and say, Tsarist traitors in Kronstadt, we've got to crush these, you know. And so most people are saying, oh, okay, you know, here's yet another fight against these bad guys.
Ah,
You know, so it, as with that Rosa Luxemburg quote from last time, you know, where she said, if this was on the level, you said this A against B, the workers would know what side they're on. But in this case, the workers are supposedly supporting this government that's a workers' government, so-called, against these actual workers, Soviet, who are accused of being czarists, monarchists, reactionaries.
ah,
And who's to say? It's just like right now, like with Trump, you know, whenever somebody says, oh, Trump is lying, and they say, oh, that's fake news. You ignore that.
mhm.
You know, because how do you know? You know, you don't have a person in person from Kronstadt coming because they
Right.
just get arrested if somebody to negotiate came.
So it's like essentially the control of the
The press, the control of the conscience, you know, of the media.
right, the
So
narrative.
nobody would hear in. I mean, Kronstadt people published a paper that was daily, but it didn't circulate very much. They're just off on this island. Maybe a few copies lingered, but you know, it's easy enough to say, "Oh, that's just lies."
Right, so controlling the narrative to support their own.
That's right. That's right. So the narrative is that our heroic Soviet government has pushed back these things, and we're almost victorious, except we have a holdout over here in Kronstadt,
Hmm.
and they're show no mercy.
Right,
And
that continues until the majority or some large percentage of the people who joined up into the Red Army, et cetera, like all, you know, have a flash about what's actually going on, right?
yeah, which is not very likely to happen realistically, because as we've seen, by the time they have a flash,
There's too
to
much.
even talk about it is a prison offense,
Mhm.
you know, and you know, the vast majority of people will normally tend to just sort of go along with the flow.
Right,
I
kind
mean,
of,
they're not just going to rise up and say, if they did that, if we did that, we'd all end up in a concentration camp. Like, I'm not going to do that. You
kind
know,
of,
they say, well, maybe we can hope that somebody in the Bolsheviks is uh, more cool, more progressive, more humanitarian, less of something like that. You know, and so you end up just rooting for which Bolshevik do you think it would be better? Oh, well, Stalin sounds pretty good. He was criticizing Trotsky, was blah, 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 blah. Well, Trotsky said, you know, and so you get into where that's the choice. Because yeah, the choice is not to go back to the czar. That's completely idiotic. Nobody practically wanted to do that. And the choice, there's no practical choice to become something in the middle, you know, like Kerensky, you know, who is just a sort of spokesperson for the bourgeoisie that almost doesn't even exist.
Mhm.
You know, and for rhetoric about democracy that doesn't really mean anything, because meanwhile people are starving to death and it's still in the middle of World War I, remember?
And are they getting, is the party, you know, the Bolsheviks, the Leninists, are they somehow paying these people? I mean, how do these people survive? Are they?
Well, once again, you have to then, they have to figure out, and that will be debated within the party or the upper echelons of the party. What do we do? And remember, one of the first things Debord said here about Stalin is that after Kronstadt, first thing they do is the new economic policy, which is to buy off the peasants, basically. It's an emergency thing. It has nothing to do with socialism in any sense of the word. It just says that, basically, it says that the peasants can sell part of what they produce. In other
Mhm.
words, it's not all confiscated. And that's one of the first things that peasants want. They're tired of people coming and confiscating everything all the crops and everything. And so the in order to have some semblance of, functioning thing, you tell them, okay, you can sell some of what, you've got to pay a lot of it to the government.
So
And
lower the tax, basically.
that's right. And introduce some market thing which can function, which is desperately needed to function, because the alternative, a socialist alternative, does not exist at this point. Merely for the government just to take everything, then how do you distribute it, and how do you,
Mhm.
that's not functional. That's just verbiage.
Wow.
So, it's what happens in these chaotic situations. I want to move on. Bill.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just interested in those lines at the end of 105, where he says, this totalitarian ideological pronouncement, so forth. Although this crude form of the spectacle has been confined to certain undeveloped regions, it has nevertheless played an essential role in the spectacle's global development. It seems like he's talking that it's a model for police state methods.
Yeah.
In,
Yeah, you might say that. Yeah, which could be extreme police state methods or just sort of generally authoritarian, controlish methods. I think I'll move on here so we can. Yeah. Do you have?
I just wonder if the police state authoritarians needed this model. Really.
Well, Debord is just saying that this mode of activity, this way of running a society, has some influence on the rest of the world, even the world that is not under Stalinism. It provides new techniques of manipulation that people pick up on. Fascism, actually, as Debord noted, partly was inspired by the Bolsheviks, because people like Mussolini and Hitler looked at what was happening in Russia. They didn't like the Bolsheviks and all that, but they saw, hey, they organized a really cool thing here where you could really clamp down, like, this is no nonsense. So that's how we're going to do it. If somebody revolts from us, we're just going to wipe them out. And the way we're going to do that is by having this strict hierarchy and by heavy load of ideology, propaganda, so that we can just come in here and say anything and people will have to believe it, or they'll regret it. So I'm going to continue here. So now we're stepping a little bit later. We've had Stalinism. So now imagine that we're after World War II, or we're getting there. When ideology has become total through its possession of total power, and has changed from partial truth to totalitarian falsehood, historical thought has been so totally annihilated that history itself, even at the level of the most empirical knowledge, can no longer exist. Totalitarian bureaucratic society lives in a perpetual present in which whatever has previously happened exists for it solely as a space accessible to its police. Once again, think of 1984, which is really, with a few details, is very much a picture of Stalinism. The project already envisioned by Napoleon of, quote, monarchically directing the energy of memory, unquote, has been realized in Stalinism's constant rewriting of the past, which alters not only the interpretations of past events, but even the events themselves. But the price paid for this liberation from all historical reality is the loss of the rational frame of reference that is indispensable to capitalism as a historical social system. The Lysenko fiasco, which we'll go into in a minute, is just one well-known example of how much the scientific application of ideology gone mad has cost the Russian economy. This contradiction, the fact that a totalitarian bureaucracy trying to administer an industrialized society is caught between its need for rationality and its repression of rationality, is also one of its main weaknesses in comparison with normal capitalist development, as in the West. Just as the bureaucracy cannot resolve the question of agriculture, as ordinary capitalism has done, it also proves inferior to the latter in the field of industrial production because its unrealistic authoritarian planning is based on omnipresent falsifications. Just to go back over that, well, actually, we can come back to that later. So here's a little digression on fascism. Next thesis. Between the two world wars, the revolutionary working class movement was destroyed by the joint action of the Stalinist bureaucracy and of fascist totalitarianism, the latter's organizational form having been inspired by the totalitarian party that had first been tested and developed in Russia. Fascism was a desperate attempt to defend the bourgeois economy from the dual threat of crisis and proletarian subversion. It was a state of siege in which capitalist society saved itself by giving itself an emergency dose of rationalization in the form of massive state intervention. But this rationalization is hampered by the extreme irrationality of its methods. Although fascism rallies to the defense of the main icons of a bourgeois ideology that has become conservative, family, private property, moral order, patriotism, while mobilizing the petty bourgeoisie and the unemployed workers who are panic-stricken by economic crises or disillusioned by the socialist movement's failure to bring about a revolution. Fascism, is not itself fundamentally ideological. It presents itself as what it is, a violent resurrection of myth calling for participation in a community defined by archaic pseudo-values, race, blood, leader. Fascism is a technologically equipped primitivism. Its factitious mythological rehashes are presented in the spectacular context of the most modern means of conditioning and illusion. Think again of Nazis. It is thus a significant factor in the formation of the modern spectacle, and its role in the destruction of the old working class movement also makes it one of the founding forces of present-day society. But since it is also the most costly method of preserving the capitalist order, it has generally ended up being pushed to the back of the stage, and replaced by the major capitalist states, which represent stronger and more rational forms of that order. Next thesis. So we've got fashion. Now we're going to go back to the bureaucracy, and we're looking at this from the 1950s, imagining like where Stalin dies, and then Khrushchev and these guys try to have a de-Stalinization thing and say, no, no, we've grown up, we're responsible, we're not monsters like Stalin and so on. So that's what he's talking about here. When the Russian bureaucracy has finally succeeded in doing away with the vestiges of bourgeois property that hampered its rule over the economy, in developing this economy for its own purposes, and in being recognized as a member of the club of great powers, it wants to enjoy its world in peace. You know, Debord, despite the fact that he's totally serious in all this, I think you've noticed the actually almost hilarious ironies that he comes up. You know, he's thinking, you're a Russian bureaucrat, and you've gone through all this stuff, and finally you're in the club of great powers. And you say, I want to enjoy this in peace. I want to relax and play golf and do these things like all those people in the capitalist states do. Why can't I do that? So it wants to enjoy its world in peace and to disencumber itself from the arbitrariness to which it is still subjected, namely this Stalinist thing, you know, you're dead, you know, because some guy at the top says so. It thus denounces the Stalinism at its origin, like Khrushchev did. But this denunciation remains Stalinist, arbitrary, unexplained, and subject to continual modification, because the ideological lie at its origin can never be revealed. The bureaucracy cannot liberalize itself either culturally or politically, because its existence as a class depends on its ideological monopoly, which, for all its cumbersomeness, is its sole title to ownership. This ideology has lost the passion of its original expression, but its passionless routinization still has the repressive function of controlling all thought and prohibiting any competition whatsoever. The bureaucracy is thus helplessly tied to an ideology that is no longer believed by anyone. This is, you can think of Russia in the 1950s, you can also think of China now and during the last several decades. They're spouting the same thing and saying how great Mao was and we're a classless society. And nobody with any that doesn't have shit for brains, nobody believes that. Certainly the people saying it don't, and most of the population don't. It's just something that you have to agree with in order not to go to a concentration camp. So the power that used to inspire terror now inspires ridicule, but this ridiculed power must still defend itself with the threat of resorting to the terrorizing force it would like to be rid of. Thus, at the very time when the bureaucracy hopes to demonstrate its superiority on the terrain of capitalism, it reveals itself to be a poor cousin of capitalism. Just as its actual history contradicts its facade of legality, and its crudely maintained ignorance contradicts its scientific pretensions, its attempt to vie with the bourgeoisie in the production of commodity abundance is stymied by the fact that such abundance contains its own implicit ideology and is generally accompanied by the freedom to choose from an unlimited range of spectacular pseudo-alternatives, a pseudo-freedom that remains incompatible with the bureaucracy's ideology. Next one. The bureaucracy's ideological title to ownership is already collapsing at the international level. The power that established itself nationally in the name of an ostensibly internationalist perspective in Russia, in other words, socialism in a single country, so-called, is now forced to recognize that it can no longer impose its system of lies beyond its own national borders. The unequal economic development of diverse bureaucracies with competing interests that have succeeded in establishing their own, quote, socialism in more than one country has led to an all-out public confrontation between the Russian lie and the Chinese lie. From this point on, each bureaucracy in power will have to find its own way. And the same is true for each of the totalitarian parties aspiring to such power, notably those that still survive from the Stalinist period among certain national working classes. He's thinking of France and Italy, for example. This international collapse has been further aggravated by the expressions of internal negation within the bureaucracies, which first became visible to the outside world when the workers of East Berlin revolted against the bureaucrats and demanded a, quote, government of steelworkers, unquote. A negation which has in one case has already gone to the point of sovereign workers' councils in Hungary, 1956. But in the final analysis, this crumbling of the global alliance based on the bureaucratic hoax is also a very unfavorable development for the future of capitalist society. The bourgeoisie is in the process of losing the adversary that objectively supported it by providing an illusory unification of all opposition to the existing order. Remember, during decades after Stalinism, in particular, whenever there was any significant workers or other revolts or movements, the spokespeople of the West, the politicians and so on, would say, well, what do you want to be like Russia? That's the alternative. And of course, anybody with any sense would not choose Russia. I mean, if they knew anything about what was going on there. And so that reinforced the governments and powers of the West to say, well, that's your only alternative, see? So it served as a sort of scapegoat to say, now, when that thing crumbles, they can't say that anymore. They can't, this division of labor between two mutually reinforcing forms of the spectacle, the diffuse and the concentrated, comes to an end when the pseudo-revolutionary role in turn divides. The spectacular component of the destruction of the working class movement is itself headed for destruction. I'm going to continue on here for two more things that kind of go with this, that are about Trotskyism and the Third World. The only current partisans of the Leninist illusion are the various Trotskyist tendencies, which stubbornly persist in identifying the proletarian project with an ideologically based hierarchical organization, despite all the historical experiences that have refuted that perspective. The distance that separates Trotskyism from a revolutionary critique of present-day society is related to the differential distance the Trotskyists maintain regarding positions that were already mistaken when they were acted on in real struggles 30, 40, 50 years ago. It is well known, for example, that in order to help conceal Lenin's famous testament, Trotsky went so far as to slanderously disavow his own supporter, Max Eastman, who had made it public. End parenthesis. Trotsky was doomed by his basic perspective because once the bureaucracy became aware that it had evolved into a counter-revolutionary class on the domestic front, it was bound to opt for a similarly counter-revolutionary role in other countries, though still, of course, in the name of revolution. Trotsky's subsequent efforts to create a fourth international reflect the same inconsistency. Once he had become an unconditional partisan of the Bolshevik form of organization, which he did during the Second Russian Revolution, 1917, he refused for the rest of his life to recognize that the bureaucracy was a new ruling class. When Lukács in 1923 presented this same organizational form, the Bolshevik form, as the long-sought link between theory and practice, in which proletarians cease being mere spectators of the events that occur in their organization and begin consciously choosing and experiencing those events, he was describing as merits of the Bolshevik Party everything that that party was not. Despite his profound theoretical work, Lukács remained an ideologue, speaking in the name of the power that was most grossly alien to the proletarian movement, yet believing and pretending that he found himself completely at home with it. As subsequent events demonstrated how that power disavows and suppresses its lackeys, Lukács's endless self-repudiations revealed with caricatural clarity that he had identified with the total opposite of himself and of everything he had argued for in History and Class Consciousness, his book. No one better than Lukács illustrates the validity of the fundamental rule for assessing all the intellectuals of this century, namely, what they respect is a precise measure of their own degradation. Yet Lenin had hardly encouraged these sorts of illusions about his activities. On the contrary, he acknowledged that, quote, a political party cannot examine its members to see if there are contradictions between their philosophy and the party program, unquote. The party whose idealized portrait Lukács had so inopportunely drawn was in reality suited for only one very specific and limited task, the seizure of state power. And the final thesis I'm going to read. Since the neo-Leninist illusion carried on by present-day Trotskyism is constantly being contradicted by the reality of modern capitalist societies, both bourgeois and bureaucratic, it is not surprising that it gets its most favorable reception in the nominally independent, quote, underdeveloped, unquote, countries, where the local ruling classes' versions of bureaucratic state socialism end up amounting to little more than a mere ideology of economic development. The hybrid composition of these ruling classes, so again, we're talking about Castro, Saddam, Egypt, Algeria, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These various countries, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on. The hybrid composition of these ruling classes tends to correspond to their position within the bourgeois bureaucratic spectrum. Their international maneuvering between those two poles of capitalist power, along with their numerous ideological compromises, notably with Islam in many countries, stemming from their heterogeneous social bases, end up removing from these degraded versions of ideological socialism everything serious except the police. One type of bureaucracy establishes itself by forging an organization capable of combining national struggle with agrarian peasant revolt. It then, as in China, tends to apply the Stalinist model of industrialization in societies that are even less developed than Russia was in 1917. A bureaucracy able to industrialize the nation may also develop out of the petty bourgeoisie, with power being seized by army officers, as happened in Egypt with Nasser in the early 50s. In other situations, such as in the aftermath of the Algerian War of Independence, a bureaucracy that has established itself as a para-state authority in the course of struggle may seek a stabilizing compromise by merging with a weak national bourgeoisie. Finally, in the former colonies of Black Africa that remain openly tied to American and European bourgeoisie, the American bourgeoisie, a local bourgeoisie constitutes itself, usually forming around the traditional tribal chiefs, through its possession of the state. Foreign imperialism remains the real master of the economy in these countries, but at a certain stage, its native agents are rewarded for their sale of local products by being granted possession of a local state, a state that is independent from the local masses, but not from imperialism. Incapable of accumulating capital, this artificial bourgeoisie does nothing but squander the surplus value it extracts from local labor and the subsidies it receives from the foreign states and international monopolies that are its protectors. Because of the obvious inability of these bourgeois classes to fulfill the normal economic functions of a bourgeoisie, they soon find themselves challenged by oppositional movements based on the bureaucratic model, more or less adapted to local conditions. But if such bureaucracies succeed in their fundamental project of industrialization, they produce the historical conditions for their own defeat. By accumulating capital, they also accumulate a proletariat, thus creating their own negation in countries where that negation had not previously existed. So I'll stop here for further comments and questions. Judy?
I didn't have a question.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I do have a question. What do they mean? What do they mean by accumulating capital? They also accumulate a proletariat, thus creating their own negation. What does that mean?
Well, that's just the same thing that Marx said. The bourgeoisie, which leaving aside bureaucracies and all this, when Marx was writing, he said, okay, there's this bourgeoisie, which is now basically in control. They more or less own the governments or control the governments, etc. And there's only one class that is able to represent a threat for that class, and that's the proletariat. For various reasons, the peasantry, the petty bourgeoisie, the lumpen proletariat, etc., are not in a position to do that. Whereas, according to Marx, and that was a lot of his work was designed to show that, was that the proletariat is a class that would be capable of overthrowing and replacing the bourgeoisie. So Debord is saying, say you're in an African country where you don't even have, you scarcely have any bourgeoisie there. I mean, there's just a bunch of population that used to be dominated by France or England or something like this. And those, those countries have now left nominally. And what's happened is that typically the tribal leaders, like chiefs or something, would end up being the new president or cabinets or something. And Debord is just saying these guys don't even, they're not doing what a bourgeoisie traditionally did, which was develop, have factories and, develop capitalism. These guys just they're just like a mafia. They just glom off whatever riches they can find. And so because their regime is so obviously idiotic, counterproductive, it's not doing anybody any good, it's very frequent that there is then a movement in their country that is kind of like, a more bureaucratic movement, like the Castro and Che Guevara movement or the Viet Cong or something like this. is going to rally people to its side by saying, we're going to take over the government and put in socialism here instead of these capitalist sellouts. So in some cases, they do end up winning. They take over the government. And then if they do the task of the bourgeoisie, which is to industrialize their countries, by industrializing their countries, they create a proletariat. There wasn't a proletariat there before. There were just peasants or people in a jungle, were like tribal situation, nothing that would have any concept of how we would organize a modern society. But if you start industrializing these things, you have your factories or your farms run like factories and so on, you start developing a proletariat, and a proletariat is the danger for ruling classes. That's all he's saying. Peter.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on 112 about Trotsky. I'm somebody who kind of comes out of a Trotskyist tradition, so this is really interesting. And I think he's such a fascinating character, and I think somewhat tragic. I mean, obviously tragic, but he's in a lot of ways the most sophisticated thinker about the problems of the Soviet Union. Even though reading this, he joins the Bolshevik Party, even though he had written that book about 15 years before, saying this party is going to usurp the proletariat if it follows Lenin's path.
Yeah.
And he goes and joins the Bolshevik Party. And then years later, he's saying, well, we need workers' councils, right? But he was one of the ones that crushed them.
That's right.
And he even wanted to go so far as to like nationalize the unions, farther than Lenin, actually. Lenin was like, well, hold on a minute. And then, when he forms a new party, people, I think, in the Soviet Union have been saying you have to oppose Stalin and come out openly. He refuses to do it until it's too late.
Yeah.
And then when he does it, he just replicates the Bolshevik Party again. And you have, even to this day, they have the Trotskyist groups have the worst sectarian tendencies where they just kick people out for anything. So he sees the problems, but he also doesn't see what's kind of right in front of his face, unfortunately.
Yeah. So therefore, he is a key figure. And of course, Debord, therefore, devotes 2 theses to focusing on that. And so any other comments or questions on any of these theses? Or if you have anything more you need to want to say, Peter. Are you all just awestruck? Kim, do we have any interesting things in the chat?
No, there's nothing much. Dan wrote 1953 in East Berlin, but I'm not sure what he's referring to.
Well, that's the thing that Dan, you can speak for yourself there. That's Debord mentioned workers revolting against the Stalinists, demanding a government of steel workers.
Right. It's
which
just
was
that
a
I had
sort of
that
crude way to say we want
right.
something that's not, we don't feel that this is a workers' government.
What happens? Can you hear me?
Yes.
What happens, like when these people, like the proletariat or the farmers, they produce their goods and do this and that. And then, I mean, it seems to me that they're kind of okay on their own, and yet all these groups kind of descend on them to control them.
Well, that's because all the other groups have a taste for food.
I know, but wouldn't they function on their own, do you think? I mean, if there wasn't any...
Oh, if there was nothing but peasants, they would function on their own, but in a not very great way, because they wouldn't have any way to make their machines. They depend on things.
Capital, you mean? They have to have the capital?
Well, they have to have things that are in the cities. They have to have people that went to a university that know how to make a machine that they can use to, harvest their crops. there are certain kinds of foods or other things that you can't raise on a farm. If you're sick, you can't raise surgical instruments on a farm or surgical know-how. You know, so you could say it's sort of, to make a simplistic argument, you could say, yeah, the peasants could survive by themselves at a sort of very primitive level, but basically the peasants are tied with the cities, and there's no getting around that. So as soon as the people in the cities come into play, who are the rich people and many poor people, capitalists and proletarians and everybody in between, then those people have a relation with the peasants that is likely to be contentious. Namely, if they buy food from the peasants, each side is going to accuse the other one of cheating. For example, in the United States, the farmers, we didn't call them peasants here, were really hated the railroads, because the railroads were basically keeping the farmers under their thumb. They could charge the farmers a huge amount to ship their crops because there was no alternative. And so the railroads were becoming rich. They owned a lot of land that was just given to them on their supposed public service by building the railroads. And so there would be a conflict there. And a lot of politics in the United States had to do back and forth with that. Like, do we defend the railroads? Do we tax the railroads more? Do we do this? And the same thing would apply with many other factors, many other things about transportation or communication, or just scientific, like I say, making farm machinery, stuff like that. On the other hand, the people in the cities don't like it if the farmers are just sort of withholding their food. But the farmers will tend to withhold their food if they don't get a lot of money for it, or at least a fair amount of money. So this is a conflict. So if you have a situation like in Russia in 1917, where suddenly the landowners are running out of the country for fear of their lives, and meanwhile war is devastating everything and all that, and so the whole country is starving to death. So whoever is in power is going to be coming to the farms and saying, give us that food. People in the cities are dying of starvation. We're confiscating it, or we're giving you this amount and you better accept it because you have no choice. So the peasants weren't real pleased about that. The only way the peasants could be sort of pleased is if they felt that they were in the picture too. So during the revolution with Soviets and all that, it sounded like, oh, workers and peasants together, we will unite, overthrow the rich guys and the czars and the aristocrats and all that. And if they felt like, okay, we'll send food to help those striking workers, or those workers that are fighting off the czarists or something, then maybe they help out. But in other circumstances, they're going to revert to this kind of traditional stubbornness, like hiding the stuff that they, so that nobody can steal it from them, and, trying to drive the hardest bargain they can get. So this is a problem that almost any regime of any sort has to deal with. And the peasants throughout history, going back thousands of years, have always been at the bottom of it. But on the other hand, they've never succeeded in overcoming it. There have been peasant revolts, but they almost always end up in defeat. Or if they succeed, they ended up just having a new government that then ignored them. Like there were peasant revolts in the Middle Ages, and they all got crushed. And in some cases, they got crushed by their original leaders, and so on. So that's one of the problems that in any list, I mean, we don't have that problem in the United States now because there's a whole different economy going here where we don't necessarily need all these, but in many countries, the peasantry is still the dominant force that has to be dealt with, and you have to, and so frequently, even though they're on the lower end of the oppressed, they also are frequently very reactionary.
Well, so I don't understand, what's the situationist answer to that? The fact that all these groups kind of get glommed onto by bureaucrats and mean leaders.
Well, let's take a totally different situation, May 68, which is a modern country where for about a few weeks, workers had control of the factories all over the country, so that there was nothing that the rulers could do. You couldn't send in the army because the army wouldn't be able to do anything. The workers, in principle, could have taken over the factories and not just done nothing, which is what they did. They were striking, but they weren't, saying, let's go back to work doing other stuff here. So one of the Situationist leaflets that Debord wrote is called For the Power of Workers' Councils. And he says, actually, it'll be simpler if I just read it here. So again, here's a leaflet addressed to workers, addressed to everybody basically, but it's talking about what's going on in the factories and laying out different scenarios. What would happen if de Gaulle does this, and what would happen if the workers refuse to do this, and all this. So he gives various alternatives. There may be a leftist coup, like with the Stalinists, there may be blah, 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 or an armed repression may be attempted, or finally, the workers may take the upper hand by speaking for themselves and becoming conscious of goals as radical as the forms of struggle they have already put into practice. You've already done a huge amount. You just have to be aware. Wow, look at what we did. We can do more. Going along the same way. Such a process would lead to the formation of workers' councils, making decisions democratically at the rank and file level, federating with each other by means of delegates revocable at any moment, and becoming the sole deliberative and executive power over the entire country. Forget the government, forget the police, all these things. None of them could really do anything against that. Like you've got 15 million workers or something, more or less in agreement, saying, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to send this food to here. We're going to, whatever. So how could the continuation of the present situation lead to such a prospect? Within a few days, perhaps, the necessity of starting certain sectors of the economy back up again under workers' control could lay the basis for this new power, a power which everything is already pushing to burst through the constraints of the unions and parties. So we imagine some of these factories saying, hey, fuck you unions, fuck you parties, we're taking over this thing and we're going to use this factory to make this thing that we need, or to run this train that we need to deliver food from here, something, or to whatever, various things. The railroads and print shops would have to be put back into operation for the needs of the workers' struggle. So there's some starts. You've printing, this pre-internet, printing so that you can print leaflets and, communicate, and newspapers or whatever, and railroads so that you can ship stuff. New de facto authorities would have to requisition and distribute food. So this means like nobody is going to sit around and starve to death without it. We're going to have to say, there's food here. There's food in the supermarkets. There's food out in the farms. There's, something, but it's the railroads are not working. We got to start up the railroads again so that we can bring that food back to the cities, for example, and bring things to the countryside and so on. And to do that, we say, fuck private property. We're just taking over this supermarket. We're taking over this, food production thing or whatever. If money became devalued or unavailable, so he's saying right now we're using money, of course. But he's saying like there may be situations where there's simply, we don't have the money. It's in the banks and we haven't been able to requisition the banks yet or whatever. It might have to be replaced by vouchers backed by those new authorities. The new authorities are the workers' councils or groups that they've delegated to go get food or distribute food or something. It is through such a practical process that the consciousness of the deepest aspirations of the proletariat can impose itself. The class of consciousness that lays hold on history and brings about the workers' power over all aspects of their own lives. So that's just a little tiny thing, and it's just a hint, but it's one of these things that would not be possible to get around. In other words, Debord, again, characteristically, when he gets to this thing where it's like we're at the ultimate turning point here, he sees what the key junctures would be. One key juncture, of course, is do you have enough power or are you just going to get mowed down by an army or police or something? So that's one thing. Another thing is, what do? You've got the factories. As long as you hold on to the factories, the army can't do shit, basically. The army itself, where's it going to get its food from? A week, you'd be a week without that, and the army's going to start mutinying itself and say, why are we fighting against the workers? That's my dad working there. So basically you can say, if the workers knew what they were in position to do, they could have done that and just say, fuck you to all the Communist Party and Socialist Party and union bureaucrats. Get out of here. Or if you want to stay here, follow the new regime, which is that it's total democracy here. And so then there are practical things like, where do we get the food? Okay, in that case, the railroads are started up again. They go, let's oversimplify it, they go to some provincial area where there's a lot of farms. And the farmers who have been, meanwhile, continuing to work, probably, unless they'd been striking, not too likely. So they have their usual harvest, their, trees and, the various foods, grains and so on. And they can then be bargained with by whatever it takes. Say, we're here. Hey, we've got the whole country is at a standstill right now, and we're waiting on you farmers. Are you going to join us or not? Or are you going to be assholes, stupid assholes, and say, no, we want the bosses back or something? We're here and we've got some money with us. We're going to give you what we can, But basically, we need a lot of food. There are people in Paris and Bordeaux and, Marseille and so on that need this. And these are people that are in factories striking for you as well as themselves. Are you going to help them or not? Well, probably in that situation, most of the farming people, now I'm not talking about landowners or something, but, are going to say, oh, yeah. I mean, in Spain, when something like that happened, there was never any problem getting food from the peasants. The peasants were gung ho. Yes, but of course, the peasants don't want to just be treated like shit. In turn, the peasants need stuff. And so these railroads are going to be bringing them stuff that they need. Whatever it may be. Maybe they need gasoline for their cars or for their machines, or maybe they, any number of things. Maybe they need access to a hospital because somebody got injured. Maybe they, there's all this. So all this stuff is going back and forth in this wild, relatively chaotic situation. And people then have to say, how do we deal with this? Right now, if we say, how do we deal with it? There's a given thing. You have to have the money. Otherwise, fuck you. You're out of here. Pay. Yeah. But in this new situation where people are already saying, what is this money shit? What kind of lives are we leading? Are we going to do this just so that so-and-so over there can become a billionaire or, whatever? Everybody's starting to question things. And they're questioning them in public, not just in a private small group, like a few of us talking or something like this. They're questioning it in hundreds or thousands of people at a workers' meeting in the factory or whatever. And that stuff is going on. And while that's going on, who's in charge here? Well, the workers' councils are in charge, or at least we're trying to be. Maybe there's some exceptions. Maybe there's some city that doesn't have that. But you can say, hey, the Parisian ones or the Marseille ones, workers are really into this. And they want this, but they need food, folks. So please get, so probably the farmers are going to say, yeah, here. I mean, they're probably going to, they may want to come to the city and join the fight, for that matter. And meanwhile, stuff is being brought to them. So how it's going to be arranged remains to be seen. Debord does not specify, oh, suddenly we're going to abolish money or something. That would be silly. He's going to say, right now, we need money. But if we're short of money, then we're just going to requisition something, or we're going to come up with something to say, hey, farmers, we're kind of short of money now, but the workers of this factory guarantee that you are going to be reimbursed. Is that better than signing a check for something that may or may not go through? I don't know. The idea is that Debord immediately, when it became a practical matter, which is a rare situation, immediately zeroes in on just those kind of questions. How is the food going to get there? Who's going to clean up? Who's going to do this? People have to decide who's going to clean up. Well, we have volunteers. Do we have blah, blah, blah? And there will be different ways that people do that. Just like in the Spanish Revolution, there were all sorts of different ways. One village might actually abolish money. There were some villages that took all the money in the village and just burned it. Said, fuck that, we don't need that. And they got along okay themselves. But most other villages still had money, and so on. But there were adjustments made, like we're equalizing the payment, so that the guy who's managing it doesn't get 100 times what everybody else does. Maybe we'll say he can get no more than twice what everybody else does or something. I mean, they would come up with different rules or ways of dealing with something. And the same thing would have happened in France if things had gone just a little bit further. That would have been up for grabs there. Like, this is up for debate. How do we do this? And one person said, "Oh, we can't take that's that store's property." And somebody, and other people were going to say, "Fuck that, man! You know, we need this." And who, you know, are you so concerned that the millionaire owner of the store get another million, or are you, you know, are we going to proceed with this exciting game that we're doing right now, this exciting venture that could have world-shaking implications for our lives and for everybody else? So anyway, I'm kind of running on there, but I try to give you a little sense of what is behind this stuff. And believe me, Debord and these other situationists, that's what they were working for. That's what they were envisaging. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been doing all this stuff, you know, taking the trouble for it. Any other questions or comments? We're now just
Peter has his hand up.
Peter, do you have?
Yeah, just wanted to comment. I think it was 111 where he's talking about how Stalinism is actually kind of the best friend of Western capitalism. That
Right.
they appear to hate each other, but they really they use each other and they need each other. And I think that's a really good point. That, you know, even though there were, you know, wars like in Vietnam or North Korea, they never directly fought. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, it actually opened up a big space. I remember I was a kid in the 90s reading Marx and Debord and Trotsky and others. And, you know, it opened up a space because no longer were the Stalinists there to either shut you up or shoot you. They're gone, right? So capitalism loses this big kind of stick where I think in previous generations, you know, there were Stalinist parties that really had influence and Maoist parties in the West that would be like, you got to listen to what China or the Soviet Union are saying or get out.
Yeah.
And now, you know, I mean, it's there's a possibility, and so that's a real problem for capitalism. And I think Debord can even see this back in '67. So that's really great.
Yeah, there's that partnership thing. There was another little group that maybe I'll send you a link to that I have on my site called Contemporary Issues back in the 50s. And they were somewhat akin to the Situationists, but a little less cultural and so on. But their main theorist, this guy named Joseph Weber, had a theory about this is right in the Cold War, you know, and he was going to say, actually, it's a business partnership between these two. And he said, you'll notice that when Hungary revolts against Russia, the Western powers don't do shit.
Yep.
You would suppose that they would be, I mean, they're sending weapons, not only sending weapons, they're sending thousands of people to Vietnam where nobody wants them. Why didn't they send thousands of people to Hungary to fight off the Russian tanks? It wasn't a shit. Oh, we can't do that. No, we might start a war. So, you know, because they didn't want Hungary to win.
Right.
I mean, of course, a lot of people wanted Hungary to win, but the powers that be, that would be dangerous. What would happen if Hungary won? You know who was running that was workers' councils. That's the last thing that people in the West wanted, like a model of a society that revolted against Stalinism, but did not go back to capitalism, so-called. They, you know, after World War II, and even during World War II, when they, you know, at Yalta and these places where Churchill and Stalin and Roosevelt are getting together, basically they divide up Europe. And if they had wanted to, Roosevelt and Churchill could have said, Stalin, you get back Russia, but you don't get anything else. And what would Russia have done? Nothing. But instead, they gave Russia free play. Okay, you can conquer Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, you know, and then they divided. No, you can't have Greece. but Yugoslavia, well, we can kind of divide that up or so. Yeah, you know, I mean, literally, they did that. And the contemporary issues guy, Weber, in talking about this, says basically they did this because the Western powers wanted Stalin, like, to sort of keep control of a certain amount of stuff that would just totally blot out any revolution whatsoever. They didn't, of course, use those terms. But in other words, it's like we're police and we're the nice police over here that are kind of civilized, and you're the bad police. And we need both of us, the bad police, to scare off the people so that they're more satisfied with the good police. And meanwhile, the bad police can also control all these other countries which are kind of dubious. We don't particularly want them. They're not, most of them are not very developed. They're just a big mess. You deal with them. And meanwhile, Stalin likes to deal with them because it gives him a big buffer zone. It means that there's no infiltration from the West of any kind of democratic thing, because it has to go through all these puppet regimes that are also pretty much Stalinist. So, you
Yeah,
know, by the time you get to Russia itself, forget it.
yeah, that sounds right. I mean, it sounds really interesting. Like the West is either scared or they look at the model and say they don't want it, and it's right on their doorstep, and the people
Yeah.
in the East are just kept down with a boot,
Yeah,
so they
yeah.
don't revolt.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And anyway, I think that's about enough. But I thank you for your good comments and questions here. And I think that I'll be sending you a thing tomorrow, but I think what we will do is finish this chapter next time. We did get far enough away that we can along that we can do that. And so we have a chat question that I just saw pop up there. Can political parties representing the proletariat be considered anti-spectacle? I know it's not blah, 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 blah. No. I think looking at it from Debord's angle or from my angle or the situationist angle, a party representing the proletariat, as we have seen, no matter what good intentions there might be among some of its leaders or participants or something like that, it's already been shown that that doesn't work. And part of the reason it doesn't work is precisely this separation. The proletariat in this situation is just spectators. They're looking at this party that maybe they vote for and it gets into parliament or whatever, and they're hoping that it will follow through on some of its promises, which usually are pretty flimsy anyway. Oh, we're going to give better conditions to that. In most cases, it has nothing to do with overthrowing the present system. It's just like, oh, if you vote for us and you'll get a raise, or you'll get something. It has nothing. So such parties themselves are by definition spectacular. The concept that they would be anti-spectacle is absurd. You might say, could it be empowering? Well, I mean, it's not very empowering if you depend on somebody else to represent you. You know, that means that the only power you have is that you're identifying with leaders, just like the Germans identified with Hitler, or like a lot of people identify with Trump. It's completely idiotic, but you know, because their lives are miserable, there's a logical, natural thing that they want to identify with somebody who is powerful and who is threatening the people that they perceive as their enemies. They can identify with Trump, say, as a rebel. And the Germans identified with Hitler as a rebel because he had a lot of stuff to say against the bankers and the that they could relate to. But that is not empowering. So I think we better stop now. But anyway, thank you very much for your questions and comments. And I'll see you in a couple weeks from now. And those of you in the literary group, I'll see you in 1 week from now.
Great. Thanks, Ken.
So.
Thanks, Ken.
Thanks, Ken.